Exploring the Titanic by Robert D. Ballard. Chapter 2. The Biggest Ship in the World. The story of the Titanic began before anyone had even thought about building the great ship. In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, an American writer named Morgan Robertson wrote a book called The Wreck of the Titan. In his story, the Titan, a passenger ship almost identical to the Titanic, and labeled unsinkable, sails from England headed for New York. With many rich and famous passengers on board, the Titan hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks. Because there are not enough lifeboats, many lives are lost. The story of the Titan predicted exactly what would happen to the Titanic 14 years later. It was an eerie prophecy of terrible things to come. In 1907, nearly 10 years after the wreck of the Titan was written, two men began making plans to build a real Titanic ship. At a London dinner party, as they relaxed over coffee and cigars, J. Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line of passenger ships, and Lord Pierre, a chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipbuilders, discussed a plan to build three enormous ocean liners. Their goal was to give the White Star Line a competitive edge in the Atlantic passenger trade, with several gigantic ships whose accommodations would be the last word in comfort and elegance. The two men certainly dreamed on a grand scale. When these floating palaces were finally built, they were so much bigger than the other ships that new docks had to be built on each side of the Atlantic to service them. 4 years after the London dinner party, the first of these huge liners, the Olympic, safely completed her maiden voyage. On May 31st, 1911, the hull of the Titanic was launched at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, before a cheering crowd of 100,000 people. Bands played, and people came from miles around to see this great wonder of the sea. 22 tons of soap, grease, and train oil were used to slide her into the water. In the words of one eyewitness, she had a rudder as big as an elm tree, propellers as big as a windmill. Everything was on a nightmare scale. For the next 10 months, the Titanic was outfitted and carefully prepared down to the last detail. The final size and richness of this new ship was astounding. She was 882 feet long, almost the length of 4 city blocks. With 9 decks, she was as high as an 11-story building. Among her gigantic features, she had 4 huge funnels, each one big enough to drive 2 trains through. During construction, an astonishing 3 million rivets had been hammered into her hull. Her 3 enormous anchors weighed a total of 31 tons, the weight of 22 cars. And for her maiden voyage, she carried enough food to feed a small town for several months. As her name boasted, the Titanic was indeed the biggest ship in the world. Nicknamed the Millionaire Special, she was called the Wonder Ship, the Unsinkable Ship, and the last word in luxury by newspapers around the world. The command of this great ocean liner was given to the senior captain of the White Star Line, Captain Edward J. Smith. This proud, white-bearded man was a natural leader and was popular with both crew members and passengers. Most important, after 38 years' service with the White Star Line, he had an excellent safety record. At the age of 59, Captain Smith was going to retire after this last trip, a perfect final tribute to a long and successful career. On Wednesday, April 10, 1912, the Titanic's passengers began to arrive in Southampton for the trip to New York. Ruth Becker was dazzled as she boarded the ship with her mother, her younger sister, and 2-year-old brother Richard. Ruth's father was a missionary in India. The rest of the family was sailing to New York to find medical help for young Richard, who had developed a serious illness in India. They had booked second-class tickets on the Titanic. 12-year-old Ruth was delighted with the ship. As she pushed her little brother about the decks in a stroller, she was impressed with what she saw. Everything was new. New, she recalled. Our cabin was just like a hotel room. It was so big. The dining room was beautiful, the linens, all the bright, polished silver you could imagine. Meanwhile, 17-year-old Jack Thayer from Philadelphia was trying out the soft mattress on the large bed in his cabin. The first-class rooms his family had reserved for themselves and their maid had thick carpets, carved wooden panels on the walls, and marble sinks. As his parents were getting settled in their adjoining stateroom, Jack decided to explore this fantastic ship. On A deck, he stepped into the veranda in Palm Court and admired the white wicker furniture and the ivy growing up the trellised walls. On the lower decks, Jack discovered the squash court, the swimming pool, and the Turkish bath decorated like a room in a sultan's palace. In the gymnasium, the instructor was showing passengers the latest in exercise equipment, which included a mechanical camel you could ride on, stationary bicycles, and rowing machines. Daylight shone through the huge glass dome over the grand staircase as Jack went down to join his parents in the first-class reception room. There, with the ship's band playing in the background, his father pointed out some of the other first-class passengers. "He is supposed to be the world's richest man," said his father of Colonel John Jacob Astor, who was escorting the young Mrs. Astor. He also identified Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, founders of Macy's of New York, the world's largest department store. Millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim was aboard, as were Jack's parents' friends from Philadelphia, Mr. and Mrs. George Widener, and their son Harry. Mr. Widener had made a fortune building streetcars. Mr. and Mrs. William Carter were also friends of the Thayers. Stowed in one of the holds below was a new Renault car that they were bringing back from England. J. Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line, moved about the room, saying hello to people. He wanted to make sure that his wealthy passengers were comfortable, that they would feel relaxed and safe aboard his floating palace. Indeed, when Ruth Becker's mother had asked one of the second-class staff about the safety of the ship, she had been told that there were absolutely nothing to worry about. The ship had watertight compartments that would allow her to float indefinitely. There was much talk among the passengers about the Titanic being unsinkable. In 1912, people were divided into social classes according to background, wealth, and education. Because of these class lines, the Titanic was rather like a big floating layer cake. The bottom layer consisted of the lowly manual workers, sweating away in the heat and grime of the boiler room and engine rooms. The next layer was the third-class passengers, people of many nationalities hoping to make a new start in America. After that came the second class, teachers, merchants, and professionals of moderate means, like Ruth's family. Then, finally, there was the icing on the cake in first class, the rich and the aristocratic. The differences between these groups were enormous. While the wealthy brought their maids and valets and mountains of luggage, most members of the crew earned such tiny salaries that it would have taken them years to save the money for a single first-class ticket. At noon on Wednesday, April 10th, the Titanic cast off. The whistles on her huge funnels were the biggest ever made. As she began her journey to the sea, they were heard for miles around. Moving majestically down the river Test, and watched by a crowd that had turned out for the occasion, the Titanic slowly passed two ships tied up to a dock. All of a sudden, the mooring ropes holding the passenger liner, New York, snapped with a series of sharp cracks like fireworks going off. The enormous pull created by the Titanic moving past her had broken the New York's ropes and was now drawing her stern toward the Titanic. Jack Thayer watched in horror as the two ships came closer and closer. It looked as though there surely would be a collision, he later wrote. Her stern could not have been more than a yard or two from our side. It almost hit us. At the last moment, some quick action by Captain Smith and a tugboat captain nearby allowed the Titanic to slide past with only inches to spare. It was not a good sign. Did it mean that the Titanic might be too big a ship to handle safely? Those who knew about the sea thought that such a close call at the beginning of a maiden voyage was a very bad omen.